Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Julian Siggers, for those who don't know me. I'm the Williams Director here at the Penn Museum. And first of all, thank you all very much for coming out on this incredibly frigid evening. We really appreciate it. Tonight, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce a valued colleague and friend. Steve Tinney wears many hats here at the Penn Museum. He's the Deputy Director of the museum. He's the Director of the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials and the Associate Curator in charge of the Babylonian section. He's also the Clark Research Associate Professor of Assyriology in the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations Department and the Director of the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary Project. So Steve is recognized not only in the museum but all the way across campus. He received his bachelor's degree in Assyriology from Cambridge University and his doctorate from the University of Michigan. In addition to the Sumerian Dictionary Project, which he first joined as a postdoctoral research assistant over 20 years ago, his research interests include developing and publishing Sumerian texts and analyzing and presenting the Sumerian language through both the Sumerian Dictionary Project and the Cuneiform Digital Initiative based at UCLA. So after the lecture, there will be time for a question and answer period, and I hope you'll mark in your calendars Wednesday, February the 7th, the next in our Great Lectures series, focusing on India's City of Victory. But for now, speaking this evening on when the high heavens were yet unnamed, how the Greek god Marduk built the city of Babylon, please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Tinney.
Thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be on the other side of the fence this afternoon, or this evening, I guess. To talk to you about one of the cities that is featured, even if not in a leading role, in the forthcoming Middle East galleries, which are going to open next April. Now, this is another talk in essentially a series I've been doing in these greats. Doesn't work. There. Those of you who were here last year, may remember this slide, which I spent a lot of time finishing my talk with, and which depicts Anzu. Anzu is the winged, lion-headed eagle. I don't know if we need less light. It's just the right amount of light, by the way. It's the camera guys who decide. Being pursued by the god Nippur. And this is an example of a combat myth which goes back thousands of years and which continues well, hundreds of years, maybe as much as 1,000 years after this particular image. And what I'm going to talk to you today is a myth called Enuma Elish in the original language. We'll get to that in a moment. Which is the myth about how Marduk becomes the warrior god and destroys his own monster, a very different monster, and builds the city of Babylon. And in part, Enuma Elish is a reworking of the Nippur and Anzu myth. So, let's backtrack just slightly and make sure we know where we are and when we are. We are working in ancient Iraq here. What you're looking at, all up and down here, is the area called Mesopotamia, between the two rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And we are going to be focusing mostly on the south today. But in fact, this collection of myths, what is founded in the south, also gets reused in the north, in Ashur and Nineveh, so we may come to that a little later on, depending on how time goes. I'm going to move around quite a bit geographically, so I want you to try to remember at least 3 important cities. One, down here, Lagash. This is actually a trick. Lagash is kind of a twin cities, Lagash, Girsu. And we're actually going to focus slightly more on Girsu, but they're really a cultural continuum. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. Then we're going to look at some material from Nippur, up here. Nippur was a site that was excavated by Penn. It's actually the site that essentially gave birth to the museum. One of our themes tonight is creation, so that's highly relevant. And then we're going to look at Babylon, up here. So Babylon, Nippur, Lagash. I'm going to start with a very, very early object indeed. I realize this is difficult to see on the stone. This is a function of the color image on the mottled stone. I'm going to show you a line drawing in just a moment. okay? This dates from maybe as early as 2700, 2800 BCE. Very, very early document. Very enigmatic document. We don't really know who this figure is. You can just make out, even in this image, there's a figure standing on the baseline here with a skirt up there, and the headdress up here has feathers, and it's called in French la figure aux plumes, the figure with feathers, and you can just about see there's writing. On the other side, there's writing all over the place. I'm going to talk about why that's so interesting in a moment. But first, I want to start with this sign here, this outline here, and this drill hole, which is the sign for Mace, Schita in Sumerian. And one of the things that we're going to follow over the centuries or the millennia is the mace that the god uses to kill monsters, that the king uses to kill his enemies. It's part of an ideological continuum. Okay, so let's look at the line drawing. A little clearer, right? So now you can see that the inscription covers both sides. As I said, it's very difficult to understand. We haven't figured it all out, but we think this is the earliest example of a literary text which is a hymn to the god Ningirsu, the city god of Girsu. Ningirsu appears as the son of Enlil, the warrior son of Enlil. He's a form of a god called Ninurta, the same Ninurta as Anzu. They're closely related, so it makes sense that he has a mace. And I'm going to try to convince you several times this evening that we can actually read some of this. You may or may not believe me. So up here, this sign Schita, beside it, these three circles, this is the core sign, the mountain sign, read Gin in this context. And this here is a pair of beads joined by a string, read Za, Schita Zagin, a lapis lazuli mace, is what he's being associated with here. Over here, Nam, En, Ak. This En, you'll see again, is a word for lord, one of the early words for ruler. Nam En is rulership, kingship if you like, and Ak is to do. So somehow this is connected with the exercise of kingship. And you'll see why this is so interesting as I develop this theme over the course of time. And down here, Nin, Gir, Su, Dingir. This star means both star and God. We pronounce it Dingir when it means God, and you'll hear me say it several times this evening. Now, there's a little bit of a conundrum in this case, because we're not quite sure which order to read the signs in. Okay? It's not as bad as it seems, trust me. I know what I'm doing. Well, barely. We're pretty certain Nin Gir Su is in the right order. Nin Gir Su. The question is whether the Dingir belongs before Nin Gir Su, as a determinative, as we call it. God names are almost always written with the star sign, the Dingir sign before them, or whether in this case it's actually part of a sentence. And it seems to make sense if you take it as part of a sentence, because the next line says, Girsu, Dingir, Girsu, and then this sign, this bar here, is me, which means either I am or you are. In this case, almost certainly you are. So this is probably, a couple lines from this hymn says, Ningirsu, you are the god of Girsu. And somehow, up here, you exercise kingship connected with this lapis lazuli mace. I'm not going to go any further with that. We're back very, very early. I'm not going to push it. Just to mention, over here we have some drill holes on the sign for field. This is somehow to do with land transfer over here. And then it segues into this text about Ningirsu, which is very interesting. So that inscription was from the town of Lagash, Girsu, as is this. This is what remains, or at least what can be reconstructed, of a Steely from a few hundred years later, let's say 2450, 2500 BCE, something like that. And it's a Steely erected by a king called Eannatum as part of his victory over a collection of enemy cities, which involved water rights, essentially. Okay? It's heavily inscribed. There's a line drawing of the reconstruction, just to give you an idea. I'm going to give you some interesting individual pieces. You can see it's inscribed all over here. The inscription is quite long. It has to do with his enemies repeatedly taking an oath before the gods that they won't breach the contract of obeying Lagash's right to water anymore. Up here, you can see what these are, right? It's called the Steely of the Vultures. These are the vultures. And here's an unfortunate victim. You can see his rib cage has already been exposed. This is an extraordinary piece. It's one of our earliest pieces of complex iconography, one of our earliest pieces of complex narrative. It really follows through from the Figaro Plume in the sense that it develops some of these themes. The god, this is almost certainly the god Ningirsu, who was mentioned in the earlier piece. You can see he's holding Anzu. Those of you with very good memories may remember that I showed this slide when I talked about Anzu last year. And in his right hand, what's he carrying? He's carrying a mace, right? Absolutely consistent. And in his net, he's got a nice bag full of enemies, which makes Eannatum very happy. Yeah? And here is Eannatum, slightly bigger than the rest of his army. The Phalanx, if that's looking familiar to you, it's probably because you're channeling the standard of Ur on the war side. There are soldiers depicted in a very similar way, carrying their shields and spears, and with their little tight helmets on here, one of which you'll be able to see effectively in the Middle East galleries in one of the displays. And Eannatum, leading the pack, you can see he's standing on a lower level than them, because they're standing on bodies of enemies, right? And he's already taller than them as well. The text actually tells us, if you translate the measurements, that Eannatum was 9 feet 2 inches tall. Now the Sumerian for king, another word in Sumerian for king, is Lu-gal, big man. So he was very literally a big man. And another of the interesting things about this document is that you can see a little bit in it where these kings look for their political authority. And this is a theme that is going to follow us, or which we're going to follow, down through Enuma Elish. Because it gives us the text, Eannatum's full name. It's a bit of a mouthful. Let's see if I get it right. It's Eanna Inanna Ibgalaka Katum, which means the one who is worthy of the Eanna of Inanna, the goddess, of the Ebgal, the great oval. Inanna is an Uruk deity, one of the old deities. Uruk has An and Inanna. And this name really makes the Lagash ruler, this early Lagash ruler, look towards Uruk in either the appropriation of power or the legitimation of power. That changes in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. This is an object which will be in the Middle East galleries. It's actually a tiny object. This is a centimeter scale down here. Okay, so it's only about 7 centimeters wide. I'm going to show you a drawing, don't worry. You can see it's in 2 registers. One has a collection of gods enjoying life in the heavens, and the other has, I think, a returning warrior god. Now this is from the city of Nippur. Nippur is special among Mesopotamian cities because it never has a king. Okay, we've had 2 words for ruler already, En and Lugal. They don't have that in Nippur. But the chief god of Nippur, Enlil, who is probably depicted here, I think, this guy here, is, in a sense, the touchstone for the legitimacy of your rule. If you're from any town in southern Sumer and you want to claim to rule the whole of Sumer, you have to provision the Enlil temple, and Enlil has to say, yes, you're the king of the land. So there's a legitimacy aspect where the kings start to look towards Nippur and look towards the Nippur pantheon. Okay? So we don't know who all of these people are. This is a little bit mysterious. In particular, I'm not quite sure who this pair of gods is. I'd be much happier if this one here were female, but Holly assures me it's not. So we're going to gloss over that sorry scene. We don't understand everything. This is from about probably 2300, by the way, very, very roughly. What we have down here is a very different scene. You can see there's a hybrid being here, kind of an ostrich person, and here. And this character, who's center stage, has 2 pairs of horns, marking it as a divinity, a deity. And what's it carrying in its hand? a mace. And over his shoulder, he seems to have slung some kind of a massive, monstrous head, maybe in a net, I'm not quite sure. And I'm fairly sure that this is a representation of Ninurta returning from some kind of a battle or monstrous defeat. Ninurta does this a lot. We're going to talk about this for a few minutes. One of the nice scenes that occurs in a Sumerian literary text which we call The Return of Ninurta to Nippur, describes Ninurta's chariot. And it says, on his shining chariot, which inspires terrible awe, Ninurta hung his captured wild bulls on the axle and hung his captured cows on the crosspiece of the yoke. He hung the six-headed wild ram on the dust guard. He hung the warrior dragon on the seat. He hung the Magilam boat on the something broken. He hung the bison on the beam. He hung the mermaid on the footboard. So you see, Ninurta has a reputation for defeating hybrid creatures and making them essentially his trophies. And I'm fairly sure that this head is a trophy of Ninurta who's carrying the mace. So we've gone from 2700 to 2500 to 2300 very roughly. Okay, going down the centuries. We're going to skip physically, materially, to the mid-18th century BCE. Now, all of the texts that come from this period, from the site of Nippur, like this one, the Sumerian tablet, may go back to earlier prototypes. We know some of them do, a handful of them we can show it. Some of them probably were composed in the 19th, 18th century BCE. We can't prove this in all cases. But there's certainly some kind of a continuum. And one of the strange things in the distribution of the data that we have to face, that we have to work with, is that there's very little literature between 2100 and about mid-1700s. It's really kind of a blank spot in the data. We have Gudea of Lagash, big corpus from Gudea of Lagash, who also mentioned in Girsu and all that stuff. And then we have a big sort of hiatus. We have lots of kings in the intervening periods who are mentioned in the texts. So all the kings of Ur, Ornama, Shulgi, Amasin, Ibisin, Shusin, they're all mentioned in texts from Nippur, later tablets, hundreds of years later. Okay? So we know very well what the ideology was that Nippur tablets were portraying, and that is that all those kings of Ur and all the ones that follow them in the 19th and 18th century look towards Nippur. There are texts about how kings are crowned in Enlil's temple, about how happy Enlil is to make them rulers. When the Ur III dynasty falls around 2000 BCE, there's a ruler of a city called Isin who writes to the king of Ur and says, you know that grain that I'm supposed to be getting to you up the canal? Well, it's really stuck here. But Enlil told me that I was supposed to control the area around Isin. And if you're okay with that, I can definitely get that grain to you. Okay? So all of these kings are playing the same game, and it's all Enlil, Enlil, Enlil. Okay? So this is a Sumerian literary text in our collection. It's one fragment of a composition which is called in Sumerian by its first word, Lugale, the king. We call it the Ninurta's Exploits and other titles. Up here, although it's not very clear, again in an attempt to convince you that this is meaningful writing, you can just see this horizontal, and this vertical, and this diagonal, and this diagonal. And that sign is the star sign, which is red, Dingier, right? It's the first sign. It introduces the god name. And after that, there's a triangle kind of thing in a box, that's Nin, and then there's Ninurta, and then it says Dumu, and then there's the N sign again, a later version of it. A little Dingier up there, Dingier N Lila. Ninurta, son of Enlil. It's a text about Ninurta, and it's a very interesting text for Enuma Elish because it's a relatively long Sumerian text, something over 700 lines. And it starts with the praise of Ninurta, and then it elaborates a threat, which is a revolt by a demon called Asag, who inhabits the mountains, who gathers an army of stones. And Ninurta defeats the army of stones, and then organizes the cosmos afterwards. He dams up the mountains to provide constant water supply, to provide metered water supply, and does lots of other things, decides all the fates for the stones. Okay? And then, this sort of prefigures a little bit the structure of Enuma Elish. And when you put that together with the Anzu myth, which I'm going to talk about much less today, which again is in inertia versus a threat, you see a pattern emerging. This sort of combat mythology. Yeah? So roundabout, when they were still writing this sort of composition in Nippur, Hammurabi of Babylon rises. And you all know this monument. We have a wonderful cast of it, which will actually be at the doorway to the Middle East galleries. It'll be kind of your wayfinding. And many of you will know what's on it already. You'll know that this is the god Shamash at the top here, the sun god, god of justice. And this is Hammurabi meeting him. You can see more clearly here, he's making this gesture of greeting. In Sumerian, this is called kiri shu ngao. Kiri is nose, shu is hand, and ngao means to put. So you put your hand up to your nose as a sign of greeting. That's the gesture he's making here. And Shamash is giving him justice, effectively. And most of this is the famous law code, which you all know, the lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? You may be less familiar with the fact that there is a lengthy prologue and epilogue in which Hammurabi explains why he's doing this and who told him to do this, and curses anybody who moves the monument, and lists a great number of gods. And it's interesting because there's a transitional quality to this in terms of the Marduk centrism. He's very careful to say that Enlil is a great god. He's also very careful to say that Marduk told him to write the Steely. It's a very, very short passage. I am Hammurabi, he says at the beginning of the epilogue. I have not been careless or negligent toward humankind, entrusted to my care by the god Enlil, and with whose shepherding the god Marduk charged me. So there's a little local, sort of non-local double play there. Okay? There is another break in our corpus. We have a very, very uneven corpus in Mesopotamian literature. So between the end of the Old Babylonian period, let's say 1600, 1595 BCE, conventional date for the sack of Babylon, we have relatively little until the first millennium, 600, 800 BC. Okay? Nevertheless, we think that the next text I'm going to talk about, Enuma Elish, probably came into being with the resurgence of Marduk in the latter part of the second millennium, the years 1312, 1100, when Marduk definitely becomes more important, when we have enough text to know that he's a significant god, and when they're starting to write a little corpus of text, which is actually fascinating. I'm not going to spend too much time on here, but it's basically a corpus of text about god napping. And the deal is that when Babylon gets sacked in 1595, Marduk's statue is taken away, but it gets brought back again eventually. And then it gets sacked again, and it gets brought back again eventually. And there's this whole ideology in Babylon itself about whether Marduk was angry with the city, or whether the heathen enemies did this of their own accord. It's very interesting, the question of agency. We don't have Enuma Elish tablets from this period, but what we have is plenty of Enuma Elish from about 800 BC onwards. We just assume it was mostly written about 300 years before, 400 years before. So this is a beautiful example, was a beautiful example, still is a beautiful example of a scholar's tablet which writes part of Enuma Elish. One of the interesting things about this literature is we have lots and lots and lots of fragments. We don't have very many full tablets, and we have to piece together the continuous text by working with the individual fragments where they overlap and making sense of them that way. Again, to try to convince you that it is writing, here is Anna, 2, and here is Marduk written. There's 2, it looks like verticals there, they're actually horizontals. And then this vertical, that's the late form of the dinghier sign. That star sign that we were looking at, it gets simplified. And then here, this corner, and these 2 corners here, that's Amar, and then here, these 2 wedges and the slightly angled vertical is Utu. Amar Utu, calf of Utu, calf of the sun god, is how they write the name Marduk. It's a little scholarly play on writings and on words. Amar means calf or sun. Mar is the standard word for sun in Akkadian. And the Utuk part, Utu-ak, is of Utu in Sumerian. So Amar, Utu, Marduk is a very clever little thing, and they play on it in Enuma Elish. I'm not going to point out those passages when we come to them, because I have another agenda here. But they say, when they first recognize Marduk, they say, Mariutu, Mariutu, son of Utu, he's the sun, S-O-N, but he also is the S-U-N. It works in both English and in Akkadian, happily. So, I like to tell a story in these myth talks, and now it's time to tell a story. And the story is Enuma Elish, and here's the very beginning of it. Enuma, A is slightly broken. There's Lish, there's another Lish here. It's just missing that angled sign. La, Na, Bu, U, Sha, Ma, Mu. When above, the heavens were not named. First line of the composition. Okay? And I'm going to do this by having very short passages on the screen, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the progress of the tale, so it's not too much reading for you and not too boring, I hope. I had a rude awakening about 15 years ago when I told somebody that Enuma Elish was my favorite myth in Mesopotamian culture, and Fumi Karahashi replied, "That boring thing, you like that?" I like it. I'm unapologetic. So when above the heavens were unnamed, and below the earth was not called by name, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter and creator Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. They mingled their waters together when meadows were still unformed, reed beds nowhere to be found. So we are starting with watery principles. Apsu is the fresh water that comes from the sky and from underground. And Tiamat is actually a form of the word in Akkadian for sea, Tamtu. So it's the fresh water and the salt water mingling together. Okay? And the first things that form in this watery matrix are called the Lachmu and Lachamu, which Jacobson interpreted as the silts. And then Anshar and Kishar. So An means heaven, Ki means earth, Shar means everything. So it's kind of the total earth and the total sky are created. And they give birth to Anu, who's the first deity in this sequence, who really has sort of currency on sort of quotidian worship at the time these texts are being written, because Anu is an important god, the sky god, one of the major gods of Uruk. Ea, his son. Ea is also called Enki in Sumerian. Ea is the god of magic. He's the next born. And then a bunch of descendant generations are born without much elaboration. The issue with them is that they're too successful, they're too rowdy, they start disturbing the sleep of Apsu and Tiamat. They're just too boisterous, too young. I'm of an age where I'm starting to understand how they feel, let's just say. Right? But the response is a little extreme because Apsu decides that he's going to kill these generations of God for being so rowdy. And when Tiamat gets wind of this, she's outraged. Apsu and his advisor Mumu make a whole plan to kill these junior gods, but Ea intervenes. Ea, in many, many texts throughout the corpus, is the god who frustrates the bad plans of the other gods. When the gods decide to create a flood and wipe out humanity, it's Ea who comes up with the plan to save humanity, for example. So here he's acting exactly in character. Ea has magic. He uses his magic. His text says he put Apsu to slumber as he poured out sleep. He split Apsu's sinews, ripped off his crown, carried away his aura, and put him on himself. He bound Apsu and killed him. He set his dwelling upon Apsu. So a couple of very interesting things there. Firstly, Apsu is the first king. He has a crown, the aura. And secondly, the beginning of this binding of the victory over a god and the topography of the later successive dynasties and generations. Ea makes his throne on top of Apsu. In the chamber of the Destinies, the room of the archetypes, in Apsu was Marduk born. Anu rendered him perfect. His divinity was remarkable, incapable of being grasped with the mind, hard even to look on. 4 were his ears, 4 his eyes. Flames shot forth as he moved his lips. So this is the heir. Marduk is the heir to Ea. But Tiamat has not really gone away and forgotten everything that happens. Tiamat is resentful that her spouse was slaughtered, and she starts to rebel. She starts to get rebellious ideas, and she's egged on by her hangers-on, and they start to create an otherworldly army. Mother Hubor, creation goddess, we're not very sure much about her, created the Hydra, the dragon, the hairy hero, the great demon, the savage dog, and the scorpion man. Among the gods, her sons, whom she constituted her host, Tiamat exalted Kingu and magnified him among them. She gave him the tablet of Destinies and fashioned it to his breast. After Kingu was elevated and had acquired the power of Anuship, he decreed the Destinies for the gods, Tiamat's sons. So on the screen is not the tablet of Destinies, but it is a tablet in the form of an amulet, and probably that's how we have to imagine the tablet of Destinies. You may remember the tablet of Destinies from Anzu. The tablet of Destinies is in Enlil's possession in Anzu, when Enlil bathes, and while he's naked, Anzu carries it away. The tablet of Destinies is the key to domination of the universe. If you have that, your word is law in the universe. So somehow, the text doesn't say it. If you think this through, Apsu's the first king. Apsu must somehow have had the tablet of Destinies. When he gets killed, Tiamat must have somehow kept it. And now she's elevating one of her subordinates to the rank of ruler of the universe. Illicitly, really. She doesn't have the authority to do it. The text both implies that here and explicitly takes it, says it later on. So now we're set up for the combat myth part. We've had the creation of the gods part, and now we've got the threat part, Tiamat and her army. Ea hears of Tiamat's plottings and goes to Anshar, tells him the whole story, and Anshar tells Ea to go and subdue Tiamat. Ea sets off to do it, but stops in his tracks and decides that Tiamat is too strong for him, too powerful. So he comes back and admits defeat to Anshar. Okay? Anshar asks Anu, his warrior son, to go deal with Tiamat. Anu does the same thing. Gets within eyeshot of Tiamat and says, you know what, I'm not doing this, right? And if you think back again, same structure in the Anzu myth. A couple of gods who are asked to do this task and they refuse. The whole thing is a setup, right? Ea's got the answer, and the answer is Marduk. Ea says to Marduk, go, my son, conversant with all knowledge, subdue Tiamat with your pure spell. And Marduk, always one step ahead, replies, if I should bind Tiamat and preserve you, convene an assembly and proclaim for me an exalted destiny. Let me with my utterance decree destinies instead of you. In other words, Marduk sees an opportunity to become supreme ruler of the universe here. And that is his price for doing battle with Tiamat and her army. So I tried hard to find a really good picture of the lapis lazuli seal, but I couldn't find one. This is a very nice line drawing. This is Marduk. As you can see in this picture, he doesn't seem to have 4 eyes, but it nevertheless is certainly him from the inscription. This is a Kassite period object, so about 1400 BCE, from this period when we think Enuma Elish was probably, at least the idea of Enuma Elish and the first versions of it were written. And he's standing, or standing by, or standing on this dragon figure, which is called a mushhushu in Akkadian. And mushhush is Sumerian. Mush means snake or kind of reptile, and hush means fierce. So people often translate Mushushu as dragon, which is not a terrible translation. So by now we've gone through, Enuma Elish is constructed in the first millennium as a 7-tablet series. We've gone through the first couple of tablets, and in latter part of tablet 2 and tablet 3, most of what happens is repetition, and I'm going to spare you that. It's a feature of much sort of lengthy narrative poetry, especially in Akkadian language, where, for example, when Ea comes to tell Anshar about Tiamat, they repeat 20 or 30 lines about Tiamat's army being prepared. And this happens repeatedly. So a large part of this early structure of the composition is taken up by this repetition. So near the end of tablet 3, they finally get round to decreeing Marduk's fate. All the great gods who decreed Destinies gathered as they went. They conferred as they sat at table. They ate grain. They drank ale. They strained the sweet liquor through their straws. As they drank beer and felt good, they became quite carefree. Their mood was merry, and they decreed the fate for Marduk, their adventure. This is standard operating procedure among the gods in Mesopotamia. When you have important decisions to make, you get together a big assembly, you drink enough liquor that you don't really care what you're doing anymore, and then you make the big decisions. Go figure. So tablet 4 is when things really start to happen, the middle of the composition. You see this in other texts as well. They're very cleverly architected to focus on the middle of the composition. So Marduk took his seat before his fathers to receive kingship, and they said, Marduk, you are the most honored among the great gods. Your destiny is unequaled. Your command is like Anu's, a serious sky god. You are Marduk, our avenger. We have given you kingship over the sum of the whole universe. And they set up a demonstration. There's a slight anachronism. Marduk hasn't created the heavens yet. He's going to do that later. But they create what we think is a constellation. The word is Lumarshu. And they say to Marduk, speak and make it disappear. And Marduk speaks, and the constellation disappears. And they say, do that again, make it come back. And Marduk speaks, and the constellation comes back. So he's got so much power invested in him by the gods, and by his magic, and by his genealogical relationship to Ea, that he can create and destroy by the power of spoken word. This is part of a whole collection of beliefs that go together with magic and incantations and rituals, and how you can change the world by reciting certain words, right? A little like I do in marriage ceremonies. Well, I'm serious. This is performative magic. So when they saw he did this, they rejoiced, and they added to him a mace, a throne, and a rod. They gave him an irresistible weapon that overwhelms the throw. They said, go, cut Tiamat's throat, and let the winds bear up her blood to give the news. So Marduk prepares his battle array. He yokes 4 horses to his chariot, destroyer, merciless, trampler, and fleet. I'm almost going to resist reference to seasonal comparisons. He set his face toward the raging Tiamat. In his lips he held a spell, more magic. The guys writing this text, the guys learning this, the guys who are working with it in the rituals, which we'll come to near the end of the talk, are themselves the magicians, the Arshapus. This is deeply meaningful to them, all this. He grasped a plant to counter poison in his hand. And at first, his resolve wavers, like the other gods before him, but he's able to recompose himself. He lifts up the storm flood and says to Tiamat, why are you so aggressive and arrogant? Kingu you have named to be your spouse, and you have improperly appointed him to the role of Anuship. That is, you have made Kingu have the power of An, and you had no right to do so with the Tablet of Destinies. Tiamat was reciting an incantation, kept reciting her spell, but Bel spread out his net and enmeshed her. He let loose the evil wind, the rear guard in her face. Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow it. She let the evil in so that she could not close her lips. The fierce winds weighed down her belly. Her inwards were distended, and she opened her mouth wide. He let fly an arrow, pierced her belly. He tore open her entrails and slit her inwards. He bound her and extinguished her life. He threw down her corpse and stood on it. And Marduk captures the hybrids as well. The 11 creatures who were laden with fearfulness, the throng of devils who went as grooms at her right hand, he put ropes upon them and bound their arms. Now Kingu, who had risen to power among them, he bound and reckoned with the dead gods. He took from him the tablet of Destinies, which was not properly Kingu's, sealed it with a seal, and fastened it to his own breast. Then he returned to Tiamat, whom he had bound, and Bel placed on his feet on the lower parts of Tiamat, and with his merciless mace smashed her skull. He severed her arteries and let the north wind bear up her blood to give the news. Good stuff, isn't it? So, after defeating the monster, remember the trajectory: creation, threat, defeat, organization. Marduk starts to organize the cosmos. Marduk is often called Baal here, by the way. Baal rested, surveying the corpse. In order to divide the lump by a clever scheme, he split her in two, like a dried fish. One half of her he set up and stretched out as the heavens. By now we're in Tablet 5. Marduk organizes the stars in the skies and the constellations, then he creates the moon god, Nana. Quite interesting. And then from the body of Tiamat, from her two eyes, he let the Euphrates and Tigris flow, which is very nice because in Akkadian, as in Hebrew, as in Semitic language generally, the word for eye, inu, is also the word for spring. So a little pun there. So her eyes are the springs the rivers flow from. It's like ayin. And all the gods are wrapped with awe and appreciation. They bow down and they say, "Behold the king." It's one of those performative utterances, like I do. Marduk clothed himself in his lordly aura, took up his mace and held it in his right hand. And then, the crowning glory of his creation, above the Apsu, I will build a house to be my luxurious abode. Within it I will establish its shrine. I will found my chamber and establish my kingship. When you come up from the Apsu to make a decision, this will be your resting place before the assembly. When you descend from heaven to make a decision, this will be your resting place before the assembly. I shall call its name Babylon, the homes of the great gods. One etymologization of Babylon, Babili, is the gate of the gods. So what's nice about this is it's a very tidy, very explicit founding fiction. You can think, if you like, of the Aeneid and Rome, right? Romulus and Remus. It's a text about how a city was founded. And there's one god that I haven't mentioned in the whole of this first 5 tablets, and that's Enlil. This all happens in complete ignorance or disrespect to, if you like, the entire Nippur pantheon. This is completely new mythologization of old things in the service of creating a mythology for a city which wants to be on its own feet and not reliant on the old gods. As if they haven't appropriated enough mythology so far, there's more. There are various stories of the creation of humanity, both in Akkadian and Sumerian, but we don't care about those because Marduk has to do it. I will bring together blood to form bone, he says. I will bring into being Lulu, whose name shall be man. On him the toil of the gods will be laid that they may rest. I will skillfully alter the organization of the gods. Though they are honored as one, they shall be divided into 2, above and below. And they are so happy, these gods. They're so happy, these gods, that they say, "What favor can we do for you? Let us make a shrine of great renown." And Marduk says, "Okay, build Babylon." The Anunnaki wielded the pick. For 1 year they made the needed bricks. Got ahead of myself there. There we go. When the 2nd year arrived, they raised the peak of a Sagil, a replica of the Apsu. And this is one of very, very many imaginations of Babylon. This one's based fairly well on the archaeology of the site. Here's the ziggurat, the Etemenanki, and the Esagil is Marduk's temple. It's all part of the same complex. And here is the processional way in Babylon and the Ishtar Gate, which we'll come to in a second. Bel seated the gods, his fathers, at the banquet in the lofty shrine which they had built for his dwelling, saying, "This is Babylon, your fixed dwelling. Take your pleasure here, sit down, enjoy." The great gods sat down. Beer mugs were set out, as usual, and they sat at the banquet. So, at this point in the text, which is sort of latter part of Tablet 6 and Tablet 7, there's a very, very long account of the 50 names of Marduk, which is technical, though interesting. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but I will explain a little and quote a little. They say, "He is the God of each and every one of us. Come, let us call the 50 names." 50 is important because 50 is Enlil's number. When you have numbers for gods, Enlil is Dingir 50. And in fact, the 50 house, the Eininu, is the name of Ningirsu's temple in Lagash. These are old ciphers. His first name is Marduk. For an example of another name, they call him Lugal Dimarankia, which means the king of the gods of heaven and earth. And they say, "We have exalted his command above that of the gods, his fathers. He is the Lord of all the gods of heaven and underworld, the king at whose injunctions the gods in upper and lower regions shudder." And then, eventually, for the first time in the entire composition, at name 50, since he created the heavens and fashioned the earth, Enlil, the father, called him by his own name, Lord of the lands, Lugal Kura in Sumerian. And then, not wanting to be left out, as though Marduk isn't big enough and important and supreme enough, we're not at monotheism here, but we're at a kind of intense focus on a single deity that sometimes people call henotheism, that is the focus on one god above others. Ea heard the names which all the Igigi, the other gods, called, and his spirit became radiant, no doubt fueled by the beer. And he says, "Why, he whose name was extolled by his fathers, let him, like me, be called Ea." So Marduk's 51st name is actually Ea. Let him control, Ea says, the sum total of all my rites and rituals. So Marduk has basically taken over everything and everyone. Okay? A few more minutes on the text, and then I'm going to talk about a ritual in which the text is used before we finish up. The last few lines of the text, and I put this slide up here because I wanted to give the last word, in a sense, to Wilfrid Lambert, who was one of the very greatest of Assyriologists ever to live, and who worked for decades on Enuma Elish and other creation myths. They were finally published in part posthumously. He submitted the manuscript before he died. And this is his hand copy at the very end of the composition. You can see it's not perfectly preserved. Instruction which a leading figure repeated before him, that is Marduk. He wrote it down and stored it so that generations to come might hear it. The destiny of Marduk, whom the Igigi gods exalted. Wherever water is drunk, let them invoke his name. Here now is the song of Marduk, who defeated Tiamat and assumed kingship. And here at the very end, we have Ilku Sharuti, assumed kingship. It's very, very interesting, the word order there, because it's the wrong word order. In Akkadian, nouns usually precede the verbs. It should be Sharuti Ilku. They make the last word of the text kingship very deliberately because of the association with kingship through the whole composition. And in fact, I don't think it's too much of a stretch. If you think about Gilgamesh, where the end of Tablet 11 points back to the beginning of Tablet 1, so at the end of Tablet 11, you're up on the walls, and the very last line of the 11 tablet version of Gilgamesh is the line before in the introduction where it says, "Open the tablet box and read the story of Gilgamesh." So that's a very conscious frame in Gilgamesh. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to read this reversal in the word order as a contribution to another kind of frame. And if you think about the first half of the first line, went on high. And the last half of the last line, he took kingship. Really, you've got an epigrammatic version of the whole text, right? Now, the Ishtar Gate. Many of you know this object. Some of you will have seen it in Berlin. It's a fantastic piece. I'm going to use it as a hook just to talk very briefly about one of the ways in which Enuma Elish was used. Enuma Elish is a fantastic text because it has a bunch of different lives. I once accidentally taught an entire semester and didn't talk about anything else. There was a class about Babylon, in my defense. One of the lives it led is that we have preserved large parts of a New Year's ritual. Very appropriate for right now, right? And in this New Year's ritual, there are multiple days of celebration. There's lots and lots of washing and ritual cleansing, lots of offerings made across a period of days. They sing prayers to Marduk and sing prayers to his spouse. The king actually is involved in this ritual. He goes across the river to Borsippa and takes Nabu, Marduk's son, and brings him to participate in the ritual because the gods move around. The gods live in their statues, right? And one of the things they do is they recite Enuma Elish to the statue of Marduk. The composition is directly connected with the ritual. And in the ritual tablets we have, which are admittedly quite late, something like 2nd century BCE, the ritual involves the king who has to be led in to the statue of Marduk by a priest, stripped naked. So all of his shows of power, his robes and his mace and his crown are removed from him. And he has to abase himself before Marduk and say, Marduk, I have not sinned. I have not maltreated the inhabitants of Babylon. And then the priest has to strike him. Think about that. If you think of one of our heads of state got hit by a religious functionary. And if the king doesn't shed a tear, it's a bad omen. So he has to strike him hard enough to bring tears to his eyes. And then the king is ritually re-enthroned because he's got Marduk's approval. So this is a late way of asserting the role of Babylon in approving of kings. And there's a long and multiplex argument which can be boiled down to this. In the first millennium, Babylon was often subject to foreign kings. And one of the roles of this kind of ritual may have been to impress upon foreign kings the importance of treating the city of Babylon in the way it had historically come to be expected to be treated, right? So that's just one of several things we could talk about. I want to push my point just 1 minute longer and finish with a very, very late reflection of Enuma Elish. Because the stuff that we've been talking about, the cuneiform stuff in the first millennium BCE, isn't where it ends. It gets picked up by Berosus, who's the guy who writes about the fishmen and Oannes, and it gets picked up from there by later authors, and it makes its way, in fact, as far as the 5th century CE, in a very short version of the text by an author called Damascius. And Damascius says, but the Babylonians, like the rest of the barbarians, pass over in silence the one principle of the universe, and they constitute two, Tauthe and Apason, Tiamat and Apsu, right? The husband of Tauthe, and denominating her the mother of the gods. And from these proceeds an only begotten son, Muimis, Mumu, which I conceive is no other than the intelligible world. It's all being rewritten as Neoplatonism, proceeding from the two principles. From them, also another progeny is derived, Dache and Dachus. This is an interesting one, because if you either know Greek or you know your Greek system of fraternities, you know that capital delta, Greek manuscripts are written in capitals, capital delta is a triangle, and capital lambda is an inverted V. So Dache and Dachus is a textual misreading for the Lachmu and Lachamu, right? So it's all from this early cosmological passage of Enuma Elish. it's relatively faithfully preserved. And again, a third, Kisare and Asoros, Kishar and Anshar, from which the last 3 others proceed, Anu, Ilanu, and Aus, Ea. And of Aus and Dauke, Damkina, is born a son called Belus, Bel, who they say is the fabricator of the world. So from the mace in Ningirsu's exercise of power in the figure with the feathers around 2700 BCE to Damascus around 500, 450, 500 CE, we're crossing about 3,000 years of tradition, and we can see it morph continuously as different places, different cities, different thinkers want to make different points with it, but nevertheless, that thread is traceable. And for me, that's one of the most fascinating things of Mesopotamian culture. Thank you. So I am happy to take some questions if there are any. There's a microphone, so on the right and then the left.
On the first line drawing that you showed, just immediately below the mace symbol, there appeared to be a Masonic symbol or something perhaps coincidentally appearing to be Masonic, and I'm just curious about that.
So which of the symbols is
Okay,
Masonic?
see where the head is?
Here?
That's it, right there.
Yeah. So I think that is. I don't think we're putting this part online, right? So I can be as speculative as I want. I think it's actually 2 signs. It hasn't really been interpreted in the edition so far. This is the mess sign here. It's the same one as over here. And then underneath it is an old version of the Ub sign. And I think this is actually a writing for mete, fitting. And that may sound, well, it probably doesn't even sound weird to you because you have no idea what I'm talking about, right? There's a very, very common word, NC, which is written with a series of 3 signs, Pa, Te, and Si, and it's simply read NC. And it's the gubernatorial title, or the ruling title, of Gudea and all those guys. In archaic texts, very early texts, Pa, Te, Si is actually written Pa, Ub, Si. It's written with this sign here. So I think somehow this is another mete, fitting something, and then I'm not sure what goes here. This is T, Gub. It's difficult. So I think it's 2 separate signs, but look, if you can Dan Brown it, go for it. Yeah, I think we have a question over here. Yeah, so the question is, to what extent does it reflect oral tradition, and was it created when Babylon was a fully fledged city? So take the first part. I don't think it had anything to do with oral tradition in this case. There might be texts that we would be ambivalent about, but here I really think that we're looking at the production of a very elite group of scholars. There's a lot of very rare words in it. The whole text has many references to incantations and magic, and this whole thing about writing it down for future generations at the end, which also calls to mind Gilgamesh. This is really a product of the intelligentsia, in a way. As for when it was written, we really don't know. It would not surprise me if tomorrow somebody put online a tablet from 1800 BC in Babylon which had some kind of skeletal version of it or primitive version of it. I think that one of the things that we have to be very cognizant of in our data set is that not only do we have these very bizarre gross spikes in our data where we have a century where we have 40,000 texts and then 5 centuries where we have almost nothing, but also the entire data set is coagulated against sort of major ideological focal points. So we have lots of Nippur stuff, we have lots of Nineveh, Ashurbanipal stuff, we have a decent amount of late Babylon stuff, but we're missing huge amounts of local mythology and tradition. And probably half the cities in Mesopotamia had these kinds of stories about their own local god and about how they become the most important city in the universe, and we haven't found them yet. I'm not sure who's, I saw one hand there, I have no idea who's in order.
This is a really basic question that I've been wondering about throughout the series. And the best I could illustrate it would be by an example. For instance, if I saw a depiction of Beauty and the Beast, I think we would all know that story, but none of us really believe that there was a beast that transformed. On the other hand, there can be things that we accept as a basis, as a matter of religion. So when you're talking about, say, these examples tonight, are the people in the society viewing it as a myth, or do they believe it as, like almost as a religious idea that these things actually happened? Or does it depend on the person?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I can't speak for them, unfortunately, although I have to. I'm going to. I apologize to them in advance. I think we could infer that they at least, let me take a step back. One issue is that we tend to think in terms of the Mesopotamian this or the Mesopotamian that. And in fact, in line with what I just answered in terms of the local traditions, in all probability, there's a lot of differentiation and nuance and even competition and incongruity. And if we look at it all as one collection of belief, it may seem to be in conflict with itself. But in fact, there are relatively few cases where that is in real life the case. Nevertheless, you can think of something like Ashurbanipal's library, where they really are trying to collect everything. This is really the only library, in a sense, worth the name in ancient Mesopotamia, where Ashurbanipal actually sends out his emissaries to bring back material from Babylon. And I see Grant is smiling. Grant has published texts in which they actually imprison Babylonian scribes in Assyria, and they let them out of their handcuffs, and they write a few writing tablets of stuff, and then they put them back in their manacles. So they're actively collecting all knowledge at Ashurbanipal's libraries. And there they have, for example, Atrahasis, which has one version of the flood, and Gilgamesh, which has another version of the flood. They have conflicting versions of Enuma Elish, Assyrian versions and Babylonian versions. So either they're trying to sort of sort out which is right, or they're just saying, okay, this is a bunch of metaphorical stuff. And my own suspicion is it's the latter, because there are some very interesting ritual texts, or commentaries on rituals, where they say things like, the ring of flour you put on the ground around the patient is the body of Tiamat, slain by Marduk. Or the reeds that the king, or palm leaves the king walks on when he enters Nineveh, those are the bodies of Ashur's foes. So they're taking a lot of mythology that we haven't heard of in some cases, and they're mapping it onto material aspects of ritual practice. And I can't see that they do that while believing that there's a single truth. They're constructing a very elaborate world of metaphor, I think, is my ultimate answer to your question. So to put it more simply, no, I don't think they believed it literally.
I'm curious about the influence, or the correlation perhaps of when the Jews were taken into Babylon, and what influence have you seen? I mean, I don't know enough about either of them. I mean, I know enough to ask the question, but was there much influence either way? It seems like there's a lot of parallel of myths going on here. Between the Jews and the
certainly, during the captivity in Babylon, there was a lot of intercultural exchange. There's no doubt about that. Many, I always have to be careful about this. I'm a textual historian. I see texts in terms of their construction over time. Many people would see the Pentateuch as having taken form in the 5th, 6th centuries BCE, so roughly around the captivity. And it seems likely that that's why the flood story in Genesis has such similarities with the flood story in Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, for example. Other similarities stem from the fact that, again, as a textual historian, the Hebrew Bible and the Quran and the Mesopotamian material, all of these things are ancient Near Eastern texts. They have a common background, right? There has been some work done about specific individuals, and it's been suggested that Isaiah was actually familiar with cuneiform as a writing system and could read the inscriptions based on some very unusual words that might be, they occur only once in Hebrew, and there might be mistakes or readings for Akkadian words. Frankly, I'm not an expert in that. I don't know if everybody believes that at this point or not. But I think we can assume that there's a lot of interchange. Yeah.
Do we know how long Marduk lived and how he died and where he was buried?
That's quite a leading question. So I'm going to say, I must say, well, not always, I sometimes think that when I'm up on stage talking about Mesopotamian gods, one of them is going to strike me down. So I'm going to say that Marduk's probably still alive somewhere. In terms of the sort of the historical transformations that gods underwent, as the Near East became Hellenized and Romanized, many of the gods were assimilated, syncretized with classical gods. So Marduk, for example, is associated with Jupiter, Nabu with Zeus. So they kind of live on in that sort of classical vein vicariously in a way. So I don't think there are any more questions. Oh yes, there's one more question, please. You can just yell. So the question is, should we relate Egyptian representations of the king holding a mace with Mesopotamian ones? And I'm just going to say it's very difficult to know. These things are so culturally specific. Certainly, you know, there's certainly interchange between Egypt and Mesopotamia as early as maybe the 3rd millennium BCE. It's not continuous. It doesn't show as an awful lot of influence one on the other. You know, even in terms of Egyptian mythology, it can be quite hard to find analogies in Egyptian mythology with Mesopotamian mythology. So I would hesitate to push the point too strongly, but it could be. All right, well, thank you very much for coming.